Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. I'm very glad to be here with you today, this February 27th, 2024. You know, we're in such an interesting era relating to UFOs, now known as UAP. Yes, I fought that designation for a while, but I think I've thrown in the towel. And you know what? UAP has certain things to recommend it in any case. There are times when I think the UFO designation still works better. Here's why. I think UAP work in a nice general way to describe a wide range of phenomena that people may observe in the sky or elsewhere. It doesn't have to be an aerial phenomenon. It's unidentified anomalous phenomena is how UAP is what that stands for now. So that could mean items, objects in space. It could be objects in the water. It could be objects in the atmosphere, landed on the ground. Anything that just doesn't make sense. UAP phenomena also is kind of vague and nebulous. So there's something to be said for it. On the other hand, sometimes you're looking at an object in the sky and you want that exactitude. And I do think that UFO is a phrase that really does still need to stick around. People know what that word means, at least for the time being. But for now, I hedge a little bit. I use both. I use one, I use the other. And depending on how the mood strikes me, or more accurately, what I think is really the most appropriate designation at the time. So that out of the way, I think this is in the era now in which we're talking about this phenomenon so much in public, not just among researchers at conferences, but it's really everywhere. You could talk about this at your Thanksgiving table. And this is not something that was often done in the past. So I think it's a good opportunity for me to put out what I feel are just some useful facts about the phenomenon in general that are worth remembering. Those of you who are longstanding students of this, you'll know these things, but it's good to remind ourselves in any case. And if you're not a longtime student, this might be useful for you in any case. I have been studying UFOs, UAP for about 30 years. It's been a long time. I've looked into pretty much every aspect of the phenomenon that I know how to. I started out years ago looking at the cover-up, the military aspect of this, the documentation. I've always felt that was very, very key. Although, obviously, when we talk about UFOs, this covers a lot. It covers encounters by millions upon millions of ordinary people around the world. Let us not forget that. This presentation is going to be mostly focused on military aspects of the UAP phenomenon. And I think it's good just for us to remember this, particularly in an era now because this subject seems to be more and more dominated in the public media by the military and their messaging, and by official U.S. government statements, for example, by the Department of Defense and whatnot. And you know what? Let's take a look at that, but we're going to look at the military aspect of it from our perspective, from a non-military perspective, as well as a military perspective. If that makes any sense, maybe it doesn't. Hopefully it will by the time I'm done. So we're going to jump in to the first slide here. I do have a few slides ready for you. Fact number one, UAP are worldwide. Yes, you already knew this, but let's talk a little bit about it. When you get into UFO or UAP statistics, the numbers are dominated by the United States. This is not, I am convinced absolutely that this is not because most of the action is happening in the United States. It is really because the United States has the most involved reporting infrastructure, the best reporting infrastructure, really. And that is because we've got here in the States, we've got two major organizations that accept UFO, UAP reports in the public. That is the MUFON CMS, their computer management system, CMS, and the National UFO Reporting Center, I'm going to talk about numbers in a moment, but suffice to say, those are U.S. dominated. Americans send lots of reports there. Those organizations do get reports from elsewhere, but it's not hard to understand why most of them are American. They are designed in America. They're promoted in America. Americans know more about them, and I think that's what you get. Plus, it is really geared toward the English-speaking world as well. But we have to keep in mind dramatic UAP sightings are reported everywhere, every continent, every nation, every region. If it's a large country, it's every region of every country. There really isn't a place where these very strange, impossible objects are not seen. And they're seen over every type of landscape, whether cities, rural areas. We often would hear skeptics who really don't know any better, frankly, saying, why do all these happen out in the middle of nowhere? That's not true. They often happen in densely populated urban areas just as much as out in the middle of nowhere. They happen in mountainous regions. They happen in deserts. They happen up in the atmosphere. They happen on the ground, that is landed craft, and they happen in space, and they happen in bodies of water. I'm going to get into the bodies of water part in another fact, but suffice to say, this is a truly global phenomenon that blankets the Earth and every part of the earth. I don't know of a region of the earth that really hasn't had UFO sightings that are quite dramatic. That includes Antarctica, that includes up toward the North Pole, that includes most of the regions around the equator and everywhere in between. So that's fact number one. Fact number two, these reports go into the many thousands every year. I've talked many times about how many actual UFO sightings are there in the world per year. It's a very difficult number to know because, as I just said earlier, the reporting mechanisms in many parts of the world are not especially entrenched or well in place. And in most cases, people still don't really often have a good place to report their sighting, especially if they don't speak English. So that is a problem. Having said that, we do have some numbers, and I want to show these to you now. So I'm a big fan, as I've often said, of the National UFO Reporting Center. I like the MUFON database. I've been able to go through that as well. But NUFORC is nice because it's always open to the public. You can go there yourself right now if you want. And it's just a lot of sightings and a lot of statistics. I put this chart together earlier today. This is completely up to date. Sightings statistics from 2001 until the end of 2023. And you can see the numbers going up and down, but they're basically very, very high. And the average over the last 23 years has been 5,420 per year. The total number of reports currently from 2001 to 2023 in NUFORC is just under 125,000. It's 124,669. And by the way, I'll point out the numbers will change from year to year because people will retroactively report their sightings from whenever those sightings happen. So what you find, and what I've learned, because I've had to go through the NUFORC numbers over many years, is that they will grow year after year. So the numbers that we currently have for 2023, guarantee you they will be a bit higher a year from now, because there will be people in the coming year who will retroactively report those sightings. So it's just an interesting thing to keep in mind. Another thing I'll point out is when you look at the early part of this century, 2001, 2002, you find the numbers tend to be a little lower. There was a big jump around 2012. And, looking at these numbers now, I wonder, is it a bit of a decline, and are we back to the earlier part of the century in terms of reporting? Only time will tell. But even when you look at the lower numbers, you're still talking well over 4,000 sightings a year. That's a lot. Now, that's only NUFORC. The MUFON system gets about the same number of sightings per year, roughly about 5,000 a year. So, and there is some overlap, but there's not a lot of overlap. I've gone through this as well as I can. Not a lot of overlap. So you're really talking close to 10,000 sightings for those two organizations a year. There's a couple thousand more that come in from Canada every year. You're talking well over 10,000 raw reports of UFOs, UAP in North America, because those are predominantly North American, every year, every year. And when I try to extrapolate out to the rest of the world, that's hard to do. But keeping in mind that US and Canada comprise less than 5% of the total world population. And so if we want to get a rough sense of what's going on in the rest of the world, I often wonder, should we just multiply that by 20, 5% essentially being 1 out of 20? Now, of course, we all know not every report that comes in is an alien craft. A lot of them are misidentified and are conventional in one way or another. Yes, we know this. But here's what I'm going to say to you. Go to the New Fork website sometime. Go to the National UFO Reporting Center and just read through the reports. You find that they're actually a lot better than you might think if you have not gone in there. My take on it is at least 1 out of 10 make me, stop and just say, wow. Yes, I know they haven't been reported or investigated, excuse me, but they are often well attested. They're very detailed in many cases. And I think, you will find a lot of them are quite believable and credible and difficult to explain. I think overall, we tend to be researchers, tend to be afraid to look at some of these reports that haven't gotten an official investigation. But you have to keep in mind, very few organizations have any resources to do genuine official investigations. That is a sad fact. So what we're looking at is a whole lot of apparent activity going on around this world in the many thousands of sightings per year. My own rough estimate, and I will fully admit this is a complete ballpark estimate, is that when I look around the world and ask myself, how many good UFO sightings around the world are there every year? I would say 50,000 a year would probably be conservative. I honestly believe that. I've looked at this enough times. That's what I think. You do your own research on it and decide what you think about it. But no matter how you slice it and dice it, there are thousands of very good UAP UFO sightings that are reported every year. It's worldwide, and it is pretty intense. Let's go to number 3. There's an extensive paper trail relating to UFOs, UAP. And by paper trail, I'm talking predominantly, again, this is within the context of the United States, of the Freedom of Information Act, and just the thousands of pages of documents that researchers started to get during the mid-late 1970s. After decades of the government saying, we don't study UFOs. We have nothing to do with this. This is not an interest. What do that's all crazy talk. And then suddenly FOIA gets passed. And I think to the shock of a lot of people, UFO researchers started to request UFO documentation as like shaking the tree, and all the fruit come falling out of it. And what we have is a remarkable collection. These are some statements that I just pulled from some of the declassified documents. You can see that they are quite dramatic. Some of them are quite famous. The phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious. That was General Nathan Twining of Air Materiel Command in 1947. Twining also described these objects as circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom and domed on top. You got to ask yourself, what in 1947 is flat on bottom and domed on top? That takes evasive maneuvers when military pilots try to engage them, and so on. 1947, and on and on. It's very obvious when you go through the massive numbers of documents that comprise this paper trail, that they are astonishing, and that they also show a great level of concern, and I would even go so far as to say at times alarm over the nature of these encounters. And the other thing you get very, very clearly when you go through the paper trail is a very clear sense of the need for secrecy by the responsible military and intelligence officials who are talking about this phenomenon. I've written about this extensively in many of my books, as have other researchers. I would encourage you, if you're curious about learning more, go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com. I'm there all the time, constantly putting up information on this and all the related aspects of the military and documentation that is involved with this. So, and we got a great community there as well. Lots of very engaged, astute members of that website, that is for sure. In any case, let's move on to number 4. There is a long history of military encounters. This sort of segues from the last point I made about the document, but it's specific. Not all military encounters are in the FOIA documentation. Many of them are seen by just people on the ground who report them, or are frequently reported by military personnel years after the fact to researchers and investigators who are willing to listen. It's a long, long history of what must be said to be thousands of military engagements with UAP. Thousands. I think this is important to remind ourselves of. The Pentagon of late has been talking about their encounters, and notoriously, I would say, a couple of years ago, the Pentagon Undersecretary Ronald Moultrie speaking to the Senate saying, "We are confident that not only will we be able to identify these UAP, but if necessary, mitigate them." That was the word he used. And I thought to myself, as I watched it, I said, you haven't mitigated anything over these years. This has been a phenomenon that has been going for decades. The U.S. military, and I'll get into some other militaries, but for now, the U.S. military has frequently struggled, mightily struggled, to deal with this phenomenon. This has included ongoing violations of sensitive airspace. That includes naval bases, Air Force bases, Army installations, and the like, as well as theaters where war games are going on, or all kinds of military exercises are happening. So it happens everywhere. And, when things like that are going on and you have an unknown object that looks like a flying saucer that is loitering or hanging out in your area, and you are the military responsible for identifying and dealing with potential threats, this is serious. And it really should not be surprising to us that there is secrecy within the military about such a thing. We have known over many years at various times there have been shoot down orders to deal with these objects. They haven't always gone very well, but maybe sometimes they have. I'll get to crash retrievals a little later. They have sometimes involved the loss of lives. Pilots, we do know, have died from time to time in dealing with this, and maybe more than we are even aware of. I suspect that that's true. Definitely the loss of aircraft from time to time. So this is a serious matter indeed. And it goes right back to the 1940s at the very least. Fact number 5, the Russians have been deeply involved in their own encounters. I'm not leaving out any other nations. Obviously, the United Kingdom, France, many other European nations, Australia, various African nations we know have had their militaries engaged in this, and in the Middle East and China and elsewhere. But let's talk about the Russians. The Soviets, when they were the Soviet Union up to 1990, end of 91, had lots and lots of dramatic encounters. I can get into a couple of them, I suppose. I have talked about these in the past. What's interesting is that during the Cold War, as dismissive as the United States government was with UFOs, the Soviets tended to even be worse. They were more dismissive publicly, sometimes referring to this as capitalist propaganda and the like. But what we know, and this is very difficult for many years to get this information out, but we do know that, in fact, the Soviets, the Russians had very dramatic encounters with these phenomena as well. In fact, one that I was just reviewing, is a kind of a notorious case from 1982 near, I'm going to hopefully pronounce this correctly, Bielokorovice in Ukraine, Western Ukraine, during the days of the Soviet Union. It was October 4th, 1982, near or at a nuclear missile base. And what has been learned, a lot of this came out during the fall of the Soviet Union. Over a period of several hours, UFOs appeared over the base, performing incredible maneuvers. And let me turn this off here. And I mean, the maneuvers themselves were amazing. You know, this kind of thing happened in the United States many times. We all know about the 1967 Malmstrom Air Force event, where nuclear missiles were shut down by apparently by a hovering object. Well, here in October 1982, you've got UFOs over this nuclear missile base doing incredible maneuvers. And then the climax of this incident was when the launch control system of the base was activated, not shut down. The missiles in this case were not shut down. In this case, they apparently were activated with the proper codes entered to enable the missiles. I think that was probably the most astonishing part of this to the Soviet technicians. The system did return to normal only when the UFOs vanished. Following that incident, there was a thorough investigation that was conducted. Of course, the launch control system was taken apart entirely in an attempt to understand what had happened. And despite the extensive investigation, there was no explanation that they could find for this incident. And the only conclusion they could draw was that the UFOs had somehow interacted with the launch control system. How they did that remained a mystery. And I'll just point out a couple of other events that you get with the Soviet Union. Back in those days, there was a very, very compelling crash retrieval event that took place in the town of Delnogorsk out in Siberia in 1986, where a UFO something crashed. And it's a heck of an incident because there was a lot of scientific information about this object that did come down to us. Witnesses saw a kind of a reddish sphere moving across the sky before it crashed into a mountain. The mountain was known as Height 611. That was the name they gave it. The object was described as this kind of ball of fire that made a big, big noise. And when the investigators got there soon after, they found fascinating evidence. There was all of these. There was a kind of semi-spherical impression, maybe about 6 feet wide or so, not really that large. The vegetation had been burned, so there was high temperatures. The soil from the landing site had unusual materials in it, including these small spherical particles that were like lead and silicate and iron, and this kind of described as this mesh-like silvery droplets. I mean, really strange stuff. The thing about it is that especially this mesh-like silvery droplet was particularly strange, and the composition suggested a technology well beyond what was known at the time. That's a Soviet case. The information was very, very closely guarded. Russian, Soviet investigators looked into this. They reported about it. But, you know, not all of it comes out as clearly as we in the English-speaking world would like. But it's very obvious things have been going on. The Soviets, the Russians had their events. There was a phenomenal, incredible event at a place called Kapustin Yar in 1989. Very dramatic. A night of this is a major rocket launch facility in the Soviet Union. You don't just go hanging out over there. This was reported by the KGB. It came out at the end of the Cold War. Basically, an object was tracked on ground radar, seen by witnesses, caused various equipment to malfunction or go blank, emitting rays. We're talking midnight and in the early morning hours. You have soldiers watching this for an extended period of time. And it's just a really bizarre event. And then another one in March of 1990, east of Moscow, involving a number of towns, hundreds of witnesses seeing these bizarre objects in the sky that were attempted to engage by Soviet Air Force. And in fact, that prompted a statement by a Soviet general named Igor Maltsev, who just said these things clearly have come to terms with gravity. It was an incredible case, and not enough is really known about these Russian or Soviet cases in the West, but they are clearly very, very significant. So that's another important element to remind ourselves of the UFO UAP phenomenon, especially so because when you talk about the two great rivals in global geopolitics, America and Russia, Americans are getting this, the Russians are getting this. My way of looking at that is it makes it a little bit more difficult to explain these, therefore, as black budget testing of your secret aircraft that your own military doesn't know about. Like, really, you're going to say this is the Russians do it just like we do? They are just as baffled by their encounters as the Americans. It seems to me that we're dealing with something that's beyond both of those nations' militaries. Fact number 6 is USOs. USOs are a big part of the story. I've spoken enough times about this phenomenon over the last couple of years because I've been doing my own research into USOs, that is, unidentified submersible objects, water-based UAP, essentially. And by the way, over the last few years, I have now collected and described over 600 USO incidents. These will be published in a book this year. I'm in the home stretch. We're doing a lot of good work on it. But let me just say, the research on this has been beyond fascinating and has officially gone into the realm of mind-blowing. No kidding. It's just absolutely amazing what one finds when we look into this phenomenon. These objects are truly everywhere. They're in all the oceans. They're in your local lakes. They're in your local river. They're in your local reservoirs frequently. Why is a really good question, but these have been reported in all types of bodies of water and in all regions of the world. All the major oceans, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, you name it, they have been there. They have frequently been reported in the water as having exceptional speeds. There are, unconfirmed, I mean, a lot of these are unconfirmed, but we're talking ex-US Navy or quiet conversations within classified circles in which you hear claims of hundreds of knots speed. Now, to put that in perspective, the fastest official submarines in the world are basically in the realm of around 40 knots. No doubt there are classified technologies by the Americans, by the Russians that can probably go faster. But the thing is, you start running into real problems when you get much faster than that. And when you get objects that can maneuver exceptionally well at hundreds of knots, or I have even heard rumors of even faster than that, now you're getting into something that's really, really difficult indeed. And so there seems to be some very, very exceptionally advanced technology that is in the oceans and large bodies of water like lakes of this world. It really is quite amazing. And then probably the most fascinating thing about these USOs is the fact that many of them are seen to be transmedium. That is, they can function seemingly equally well in the water as in the atmosphere. Those are two different mediums, and that's very difficult to do. Officially speaking, we have a couple of objects that could, roughly speaking, be qualified as transmedium. But the problem is you really lose a lot of performance when in one or both of those media. So whether if it's in the ocean or in the air. But what we're talking about here are objects that are just absolutely smooth and perfect in the air and in the water. Countless instances in which witnesses have seen objects leaving bodies of water, craft leaving bodies of water, or entering controlled descent into bodies of water. It's really quite fascinating. This is, it's a significant part of the phenomenon, not because they are especially common, because they're not. I mean, I've collected over 600. Sounds like a lot, but when you compare it to the many, many thousands of good UFO, UAP sightings that take place in the atmosphere, it's a small amount. But it's just, you have to ask, why is it a small amount? One reason, quite frankly, is that we're mostly landlubbers, and we're not out in the middle of the Atlantic or Pacific or Indian Oceans. And so if you're not out there to witness it, well, you're not going to see it. A lot of those sightings do take place with Navy personnel who, for obvious reasons, are going to be constrained to secrecy. We do get some of those stories years after the fact anyway, but it wouldn't be surprising for us, obviously, that many of them don't come down to us. A lot of the USO cases that I have tracked are seen by civilians who live at the shore overlooking a body of water. And of course, that's perfectly logical when you think about it. If you're living, 100 miles inland and you're not by a body of water, well, you're not going to see these things. But if you're living at a beach or near the coastline, you're going to see many of them. And incidentally, and I have talked about this here on this channel before, but probably the biggest hot spots, I don't know in which order I can say, but the biggest hot spots that I have noticed where the most intense number of sightings of USOs are reported, I would say the Caribbean, specifically Puerto Rico, but the Caribbean in general. The west U.S. coast off of near the Channel Islands, famously Catalina Island, very, very well known for that. And that is a definite hotspot. But one hotspot that I don't think that people were quite aware of is the U.S. and Canadian northeastern coastline, the Atlantic seaboard. Is actually, there's a lot of USO activity that has been recorded there. I would also add, though, out in Asia by the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk, off the Asian coast there is quite active. Persian Gulf has had a long history of activity there. The Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea, lots of activity in these areas as well. And definitely, I would say off the coast, the Atlantic coast of South America. So you're looking off the coast of Brazil and Argentina. And to a certain extent, also off the coast of Chile, facing the Pacific. Not as many. I'm not sure that there's less activity there, but I think just fewer reports are coming to us. So these things are being seen everywhere. And I look forward, by the way, to publishing the results of this study as soon as I'm certainly able to do so. Moving on to fact number 7, UAP have disabled ships. I cannot emphasize how important this is. We all know, we've all heard stories about how these objects can interfere with or have an interest in nuclear technology. That is absolutely true. They have and they do, and that's very important. But something that, again, this comes through my research into USOs over the last 2 years, is that there's a definite subset of those reports and of Navy encounters in which these have, whether intentionally or not intentionally, it's not always clear, interfered with critical operations of U.S. Navy vessels, and not always U.S. Navy. Sometimes these are, commercial vessels as well. And sometimes I have cases in which they interfered with and severely disabled temporarily Soviet Navy vessels. And in fact, I have one here. Let me just move to my next slide for you. There are instances where communications on a ship will be shut down for 20 minutes or 30 minutes at a time. This was an incident involving, I talked about this on this channel here, 1971, involving the USS John F. Kennedy aircraft carrier, in which a large glowing spherical object hovered over the ship, and communications in and out were just shut down for about almost a half hour. There are times when weapon systems would not operate as well. And there are even times when these ships were dead in the water, just not functioning. Here's one from the Soviet Navy that I'll just read for you here from October of 1988. In the Pacific Ocean by the Kuril Islands, between Japan and the Russian mainland there, at a little place in the Kuril Islands called Shikotan Island. October 1988, it was night. We don't have the exact date, but definitely a large luminous object. You have, it was reported in a newspaper at the time, described later to the Ukrainian researcher Paul Stonehill, who does excellent work. Essentially, during a training exercise by this Soviet aircraft carrier named Novorossiysk, about 9 o'clock at night, the crew sees an enormous object, they say, emerging from behind this tiny island, Shikotan Island. It's covered with lights. They said it was as many as 36 lights, created a kind of geometric pattern. As the craft ascended, all of the electronic systems aboard the ship ceased to function. The ship had powerful diesel engines. They fell silent. And even the portable battery-operated accumulator radio stations failed to operate. This was a state-of-the-art vessel. It had cutting-edge electronics, and it found itself defenseless. It was transformed into nothing more than a heap of metal anchored 3 miles away from the island. By the way, fishermen on the island also saw this object, and after about 40 seconds, after the object left, the ship's systems came back online one after the other. And so there you go. I mean, it was just an amazing thing. The whole incident lasted about 15 minutes. About typical when you get into these types of Navy types of encounters. They're often 10 or 15 or up to 30 minutes, or sometimes they have sometimes lasted a couple of hours. They are really fascinating. And the fact that you get Russian cases and American cases that really mirror each other very well in many instances, I think adds to the credibility of these cases. So let's go to fact number 8. Crash retrievals are real. Again, this is something I've talked about many, many times on this YouTube channel here. Go check out some of my crash retrieval videos if you're interested. We all heard last summer of 2023, David Grush, U.S. Air Force intelligence officer and a brilliant man, speaking very explicitly, I would say, to the Congress in the vein that after having spoken to about 40 or so witnesses within the U.S. military structure, that he was confirming to members of Congress that, yes, these crash retrievals are real. We, the United States, or contractors, have their technology, and as he famously put it, their biologics. That was a huge shock, I think, for many people in the public. But I just will remind you now, as I have reminded you over many, many months and years, that David Grush was by no means the first person to make these statements, obviously. I'm a big admirer and a fan of the work of the late Leonard Stringfield, UFO researcher, who died in 1994. Stringfield interviewed hundreds of individuals in the 70s, 80s, and in the 90s who had connections to UFO, UAP crash retrievals. His accounts of these investigations are very well written. They're very clear. They're very detailed, meticulous. You can find Stringfield's book online. It's not cheap, but it's actually worth it. If you're a serious student of this phenomenon, I could not urge you to get any other book before you get Stringfield's work. I think it's that important. But beyond Stringfield, there has just been much, much more in terms of evidence of UFO, UAP crash retrievals. Just the other day, I was going through some old records and I looked at the statements of the late Brazilian investigator, Dr. Olavo T. Fontes. This is going back to the 1950s and 60s. Fontes was really the first great prominent UFO researcher of that country in Brazil, who reported back then that there were a number of flying discs, I think he said 6, that had crashed, that were captured and taken apart by military forces, military people, and scientists under very strict security conditions. That was Fontes talking about this back in the 1950s and 60s. And beyond that, you've got numerous claims coming out of classified circles within the United States and other parts of the world about this phenomenon having occurred. Skeptics are always going to say, well, show me the proof. And we understand that. We all want to have the actual proof in our hand. Of course, you might argue, one might say that the metamaterial, which seems to have gone missing now in possession of the U.S. Army, might have been or might be such proof. It's certainly an interesting piece of material, which was discussed over the last couple of years. Maybe we'll get some information on that. But essentially, what I would say, the real argument is when you start looking at the mass of witness testimony that is coming in from all of these different directions, I think responsible investigators are obligated to consider this as a viable hypothesis. And I would just say that the accounts of UAP crash retrievals are much more numerous than you might think. And also, you get into the testimony, I am sure you will find that they are much more credible than you might think if you have not explored them. So onward to number 9. Missing time is real. Now we're moving away from just pure military cases. And I think this is important because you know what? In the last few years, really since 2017, since the world has seen a revival in discussion of UFOs or UAP, which is, I think, a good thing. But one thing we haven't seen very much of, unfortunately, is a discussion of some of the more dramatic and, for the people who experience them, much more important element of this phenomenon. That is missing time, where something happens to actual people who report UAP encounters. And the reality is many reported UAP encounters accompany claims of missing time by the witness. Only a small number of these will actually get any follow-up by researchers or investigators. Most don't. And what you often find is, someone, again, a lot of these will get reported years after the fact, because the reality is, if something happens to you at the time where you have an hour or two of missing time, almost every single instance of that, the person is very hesitant to report this because it's confusing to them, it's disturbing to them, and they don't really know what to do with it. And so frequently those types of encounters get reported much, much later down the road. I'll just give you one that I pulled up. This is in my USO research, and it's just right there in front of me, and I thought I'd share it with you. From July 15th, 1988, not that long ago. This is off the coast of Catalina Island, California. It took place at night. It involves something very, very large. What you have is an experienced night scuba diver. This is July 15th, 1988. He's making a routine crossing from the mainland, from California to the island. It's about 30 miles, I think, across the water there. So he landed a little bit too far east of his intended landing, which was to be at 2 harbors on Catalina Island. So he adjusted his course. He's continuing westward along the coast of the island toward his destination. So everything seems just fine. It's at night, but he's right by the coastline of Catalina Island, so everything seems good. Well, about 10 minutes into his adjusted journey there, the ocean around him lit up from below. The light extended about 100 yards on either side of his boat. You think about how large it is. That's a football field. It was unlike anything that he had ever encountered in his diving experiences. This was not a diffused glow that you might expect when you're underwater. This was, he said, it was a perfect square, and it lasted, as far as he could tell, for about 15 seconds, and then it disappeared. Problem was that upon reaching Two Harbors, he realized he had lost 2 hours of time. And it was, it was a weird thing because it was puzzling to him at the moment. But I think, like a lot of witnesses, it seems weird to say this, but he gave it very little thought at the time. A lot of people, we don't all react the same way to these types of things. Not everyone goes into freak out mode when something like that happens, because you don't want that to dominate your consciousness. You don't want to deal with the implications of what just happened to you. It was only years later, after learning about USOs, this man said, that he began to consider the possibility that his experience might have been an encounter with something unidentified, like a USO. And then, I think about that particular case. I'll just say he didn't report seeing an object. Okay, so that's an important thing to say. It was only this unexplained square-shaped light under the water. But you have to ask, what could have caused such a 15-second light display in the ocean at around midnight, which is when this happened, of a light that was not diffuse, but actually had sharp edges, which was square in shape and with sides of at least 2 football fields, because it went 100 yards on either side of his boat. I mean, what was that? Could that have been a large underwater ship or even a base? If it's a base, you have to wonder, how could this not have been explored and detected by other divers? This is the thing. This is the thing that makes UFOs, USOs, UAP so fascinating. There's a dramatic mystery and a difficult to explain phenomenon that is all around us. By the way, that was a MUFON case that was sent in to MUFON. That case does appear in my book, which will come out in a couple of months, and you'll get to read it there. So, these are we're really talking about some incredible events here. And then the last fact, for now, I'll probably want to come back with some more relevant facts, because I think this is useful. But fact number 10 is that you often do get sightings of beings. Maybe we can even say aliens, that are often seen in conjunction with UAP or UFO sightings. And this is, I'm not just talking about abductions here. I mean, just in general, where people see an object. It is not that unusual. Well, it's slightly unusual, but it's not unheard of, where a being that is a witness will see silhouettes of people or beings inside the craft or outside the craft, sometimes seemingly engage in some kind of activity, maybe taking biological samples. And by the way, there were lots of those claims back in Europe in 1954, particularly in France and Italy. You had witnesses reported seeing small beings. Often they were back then called humanoid instead of alien, but the same thing. Sometimes with large heads, wearing something that looked like spacesuits or some kind of suits to them. Not the same as gray aliens that you often hear about today. And so that really does make you wonder, like, were these different creatures, or did they, is this a purely, you have skeptics saying this is a purely psychosocial phenomenon because witnesses are seeing these beings that fulfill their own cultural expectations. Probably many of us have heard this argument. The problem is, you get into the details of these witness accounts, and they are very highly specific in large numbers of cases. And, the problem really is, what do? You just dismiss all of these with a wave of the hand and say, oh, well, you're just seeing things. I don't think that's responsible. When you get into that 1954 wave of sightings, there were many of them. And I've read a lot of the witness testimony myself of a number of those cases, and they are absolutely fascinating. Fast forward back into the 1960s, famous case in Socorro, New Mexico, by a New Mexico police officer named Lonnie Zamora. Famous case, of course. He sees a landed egg-shaped object, two small beings standing nearby. He's terrified. He actually initially ran away, but then decided to go and investigate anyway. And the beings ran into the craft, and the craft took off, and he watched it leave. His sighting is considered one of the most credible in UFO history, and I think rightly so, due to his status as a police officer and the physical trace evidence that was left at the scene. Very interesting. But there are lots of other instances where, witnesses are seeing beings associated with these craft. There's an interesting one that I remember from years ago, from 1976, by the Canary Islands in the Atlantic Ocean. You had a number of witnesses seeing a large spherical UFO, UAP, that gave off a very bright light. And associated with that sighting were reports of very tall beings that some were seen in a craft, some were seen on inspecting the ground. They were described as being over 2 meters tall, by the way, so really quite tall, and wearing some kind of tight-fitting suits. And then more recently, or at least in the later 20th century, you've got the famous case of 1994 in Ruwa, Zimbabwe. You have 62 school children who see a landed UFO and two small beings near their school during recess. They describe these beings as having large heads and large eyes. Some reported receiving telepathic messages about the state of the Earth's environment, and so on. Those kids then are all adults now. They're all in their basically their mid-30s, and they have continued to speak very, very articulately and eloquently about their experience. They're quite fascinating. Very good movie by a friend of mine, Randall Nickerson, called Aerial School Phenomena. Go check it out. It's a great movie. So there you go. Those are 10 facts about UAP that you may or may not have known or appreciated. I hope that you can make some good use out of this information. I find that we're in an era where information is just moving so fast relating to UFOs, what once we used to call UFOs, now UAP. It's sometimes tough to keep up. I have to struggle to keep up. I got folks at my website who keep me on my game. I can thank them for that, but it's a lot of work. And for that reason, I feel very strongly that it's important for serious students of this phenomenon to remind themselves of some of the really key fundamentals that are involved. This is a serious, widespread, numerically intense phenomenon that involves every part of the world, that has involved national security from the word go, since it really became a national security matter in the 1940s. Not saying it started in the 1940s. It didn't. It goes back prior to that. But you start getting serious national security attention in the 40s, and that's when the cover-up began. By the way, the cover-up's another fact about UAP. I'll come back to that one again in the future, along with many other facts that are important. So I hope, again, you found this video interesting. If so, hey, hit me up with a like, share the video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that already. It does definitely help me out, and I can always use your support in that matter. If you want to continue supporting what I do check out my website at richarddolanmembers.com, where I do this kind of work all the time with a very active and amazing community over there of very engaged students of the UAP phenomenon that are over there as well. And that's it. That's all I've got for you. I want to thank you for being here with me for this time. I will be back again. In the meantime, let us never forget to keep fighting the good fight. Later.